So we're in your government book. We're in chapter 3 and covering chapter 3 and part of chapter 4. There are a few profiles and important things that we need to know during this time period. What time period are we talking about? The time period of the beginning of our country, the time period of the Declaration of Independence, and on to the time period, 10 years later, of the forming of the Constitution of the United States. And so in these profiles, there was some men that were very important during this time. And so I'm going to go over them, and these will quickly, some of your profiles we already did, but there's a couple of them that I wanted to go more in detail. And one was Edmund Burke, another would be James Madison, and of course another would be Benjamin Franklin. So we're going through them very quickly, as you could do an in-depth study of them surely, but let's start with Edmund Burke. It says he's a parliamentarian and an American ally. So he served in the decade between 1765 and 1775, which led directly to the American War for Independence. So he was in the Parliament during this time for 10 years. And during this time, it led to the war, which I'm sure he looked at as a war that should not have really happened. Burke was an Irishman. He lived 1729 to 1797. In a speech, he gave a speech on American taxation. He also did another speech on moving his resolutions for reconciliation with the colonies. So he sought to convince his countrymen in England to support Americans and to support that Americans were being taxed beyond. They were not treated as Englishmen. And so his call was that Americans would come and be treated by the Parliament and by the King with English liberties, or the same English liberties or freedoms that Englishmen had. And that indeed is what the colonists wanted. So he also was concerned with easing the problems in Ireland, as he was an Irishman. And also he stood up for what was going on with the British in India too. So he was very much standing for the underdogs in many cases. Him being Irishman would be considered an underdog in the Parliament for sure. So reflections on the Revolution in France. He also brought and compared the French Revolution later on, how the French Revolution was not the same as the Revolution or the War for Independence in America. The French, of course, wanted to do away with the past and establish a total new economic, political, and social order that was in comparison to socialism or even on into communism. And Burke was an outspoken opponent of the French Revolution. So here he stood against the French Revolution, but for the American War for Independence. The heart of Burke. Why do you think he did this? Well, the heart of Burke, he was very much, saying that good government is impossible apart from a foundation of virtue or religion and morality. Okay, let's see. That was the difference. He saw in American that Americans were standing up for God and virtue, and stood, in religious freedom. What did the French stand for? They stood for enlightenment, and in the midst of that, they strove to go against God and against morality. In fact, they wanted to do away with the Bible altogether, if you read a lot of the French revolutionaries at that time. So they were standing against religion, and that's what he called the difference between the French Revolution and the American War for Independence. He believed the rights which Englishmen enjoyed were the result of long centuries of constitutional developed mind. The constitutional developed mind, he talked about it. He said civil freedom is a blessing and a benefit not an abstract speculation. So he said we can have civil freedom, and it's a blessing and a benefit. When you think of the words blessing and benefit, what do you think of? I hope you think of the Lord, right? The Lord's blessing and the Lord's benefits. And that's indeed what he felt too. He said, whenever a people have proved themselves worthy by the practice of virtue, then they will be allowed ever greater civil liberties and political responsibilities. So he definitely was the father of modern conservatism. When you think of modern conservatism, you think of conservative, the old ways. Well, actually, the old ways he focused on were the ways that were present in the Bible from the beginning of time. And so his conservatism wasn't just, okay, the values of what we had before, because what you had before is not always good. But his values were those of virtue. Basically saying what he said here was the practice of virtue. If we practice virtue, which virtue is goodness, what is good in our lives, and what is pure in our lives, and what is kind in our lives, and those things of biblical value, then we would be allowed greater civil liberties, greater civil freedom, greater freedoms of government. But through greater freedoms of government, there will become greater responsibilities to keep our freedoms of government. So when we look at Edmund Burke, we look back as he had a mind actually of the time, yes, but also of the future. Because don't we now look at a time where our civil liberties, our government is vowing to take over a lot of our freedoms, especially our freedoms to preach the gospel, right? So looking forward to this time. Now you look at his face here and you think, oh, did he really know about, the times that we live, 2024, these times, these end times? Well, he indeed did. Look, if we do not stand on the virtues, if we do not stand on biblical values, if we are not born of the Spirit, then our civil liberties will be taken. But we have hope in the Lord Jesus Christ. For his return, someday every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. So let's go on. See if I can change this very easily. It's a little hard here. Here we go. Picture of the Battle of Lexington here. Okay. Here again we have the signing of the Declaration of Independence. As you see, Thomas Jefferson there, right? And he actually was, the writer of the Declaration of the Independence there, Benjamin Franklin. And anyway, we have a picture here, the Declaration, showing the men that were there to sign the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is not the Constitution, it's the document. So, a revolution prevented. This is exactly what I've been talking about. And this was taken from The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk. So, and this is in 1953. But as we read this, it's like today. The foundations of American liberty, a revolution prevented. By and large, the American Revolution was not an innovating upheaval, but a conservative restoration of colonial prerogatives. As Burke, remember Edmund Burke, puts it, a revolution not made, but prevented. So that's what he was calling, Edmund Burke was calling our revolution. It was a revolution not made, but prevented. So Americans didn't want a revolution. They wanted to prevent the revolution. They tried as they may. In fact, England, Great Britain declared, and the king declared war on America before America stood up to declare war on Great Britain. Accustomed from their beginnings to self-government, the colonies felt that by inheritance they possessed the rights of Englishmen, and by prescription, long use, certain rights peculiar to themselves. When a designing king, as the King George came through, and a distant parliament presumed to extend over Americans' powers of taxation and administration never before exercised, The colonies rose to vindicate their prescriptive freedom, and after the hour for compromise had slipped away, it was with reluctance and trepidation that they declared their independence. Thus, men essentially conservative found themselves triumphant rebels and were compelled to reconcile their traditional ideas with the necessities of an independence hardly anticipated. That is just the words just saying exactly what happened. In the midst, we have conservative Christian people in America, and basically coming to confront a king now that had decided to take away their rights and privileges, as not being equal and presuming as they were Englishmen. So they had seen this and coming to the king and presenting what had happened, presenting to them those atrocities committed in form. The king ignored them. So in the midst of all this, which had never before happened to them with the kings prior to this time, the hour had come and they could not compromise anymore. They had tried to compromise with the parliament. They had tried to compromise then for the king, the parliament having only the powers of the king. And it was with reluctance and trepidation, that means reluctantly, these men, these Americans, these conservative Americans found themselves as triumphant rebels. Isn't that the way it goes with God? Is that we just go through our lives and just say we just want to live our lives with kindness and goodness and love and bring our families up in the Lord, and suddenly we're presented with great trials and tribulations, and the enemy attacks us. In the midst of that, we stand for righteousness. In the midst of a war of terror on our souls, we stand for righteousness. And what happens when we stand for the righteousness of God? Thus, we essentially, though we've always been conservative and always wanted peace, end up triumphant, considered as triumphant rebels. Rebels to what? Rebels against unrighteousness, right? And so we find ourselves as heroes. You take those examples from the Bible throughout, from David standing against Goliath, from Gideon's army, on down, from Moses in the midst, and from the humility of Jesus Christ. So as we stand for the Lord, we will become heroes throughout time. And that's what happened in America, essentially. See, we're standing for kindness and goodness and the grace of God, presenting those things to compromise with, they could not. It's the hour for compromise has slipped away. We're no more compromising. And now we stand for righteousness and we will become triumphant. I love that. So I had to go over that because I wanted to make sure that you really understood what this little Foundations of American Liberty represents. So now I'm going to go on to the next chapter. So let's see if I can... let's see. Before I go into the next chapter, I probably should let's go over the review. I don't think I went over the review of section 4, which is pretty important because there might be some questions that you need to know on your test and such. So let's see. Section 4 review. How did the relationship between the English monarch and the American colonies change when George III came to the throne? So the relationship in America, the American colonists, they were under the king and they were loyal to the king. So when George, the king, decided to restore his power, and basically by taking over the parliament with those that supported him in the parliament, the king's friends in the parliament, he wanted to exert power. He could care less about Americans at that time. So when America presented, those things, those atrocities, those things committed against them at this time. George III did not, care to support them, and actually declared a war on America. So George was determined to restore the power of the monarch by supporting the king's friends and bringing forth the king's power. He was a power-hungry king, let's just say that. And he wanted to basically have America bow to his every need, and to take away their rights. So, number 2, according to the Stamp Act Congress, why were the colonists not under the authority of the Parliament? Okay, the Parliament. So why didn't the colonists just go to the Parliament and talk to the Parliament? Well, because of their charters. Because all the charters that were to the colonies, each colony charter was from not the Parliament, but from the king. And so they were called royal charters. So the Stamp Act Congress agreed that the Parliament not even be mentioned, not even in the Declaration of Independence at all, because their charters had nothing to do. They felt nothing to do with the Parliament, but only to do with the king and the king's power. So, number 3, what British tax did the colonists protest in the Declaration of Rights and Grievances? Well, the tax that they hated the worst was called the stamp tax. Why? Because they had to stamp all of their legal documents. And when they put the British stamp on their documents, they would have to pay for a tax on their stamps. So that means if they put a stamp and said, okay, we're going to have a birth certificate or a death certificate or even a baptism certificate or any other legal document at all, land rights or anything, they would have to put a stamp, and these stamps would be very expensive, so they have to pay for the British tax for the stamp, and never before had there been a tax like this, especially in America. And so they declared that there was a test in their Declaration Rights and Grievances. They were grieved that they had to give money as taxes just to put a stamp on their legal documents in America. So number 4, what assembly met in response to the Intolerable Acts? So the Tolerable Acts, because of the Assembly of the Intolerable Acts, the Congress met in where? Philadelphia, at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And they put together what is called the First Continental Congress. Let me tell you, the First Continental Congress was not the one that would declare the Declaration of Independence at all. The First Continental Congress was basically standing up to the intolerable acts that were being committed by England against America. So the first getting together was called the First Continental Congress. So, number 5, how did the Second Continental Congress assume political power? So after the First Continental Congress was adjourned and basically bringing their grievances, I should say, and atrocities that had been committed and grievances to England at this point. So at that point, they had adjourned. They were looking to form another Second Continental Congress to get together, especially when they were not hearing, or when they would hear the results of what the king would say. And we know the king would declare war on America. So how did the Second Continental Congress assume power? Well, the Second Continental Congress assumed power after the conflict between the American patriots and the British troopers came in on April 19th of 1775 in Lexington. The shot heard around the world. So the Second Continental Congress assumed political power after war had begun. And war had begun as the British troopers fired on the American patriots. And the shot heard around the world. The whole world then knew America was going into war with Great Britain. So, number 6, what were the two actions of Parliament's Prohibitory Act? So, the two actions of Parliament's prohibited acts were, first of all, England would cut off all trade with America. America could not trade in any way, merchant or other, with England. The other, removed from the colonies any of the king's protection. So the colonies in America would not have the protections of Great Britain anymore. In fact, the colonies would be at war with Great Britain. So not only removing the king's protection, but declaring war. But the two actions were basically cutting off trade and removing the colonies from the king's protection. Number 7, who presented a resolution for independence to the Second Continental Congress? Okay, the Second Continental Congress came to be after the shots were fired. After we were already in the midst of the beginnings of a war, right? So what would the Second Continental Congress, a certain person presented that we needed to declare independence because England had declared war on us. So that basically, who did this? The second was Richard Henry Lee. You'll find that in your book. So you barely hear of his name, right? We hear of Thomas Jefferson and on to all of the signers of the Declaration, but Richard Henry Lee on June 7th, 1776. Remember, on July 4th, 1776 was the Declaration of Independence. But on June 7th, which is a month before, he was from Virginia, and he declared that we needed to declare and get a committee together to declare a declaration from independence from Great Britain. So number 8, who was responsible for drafting the Declaration of Independence? I hope you know that. Thomas Jefferson, who would be our 3rd president of the United States. Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. He was the head of the committee. Also, we had other, John Adams was on the committee. The committee was a group of men that put together the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson being ultimately that drafter of the Declaration. So number 9, give the date for the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. I hope you know that. The 4th of July, July 4th, 1776, was our Declaration of Independence. Number 10, what Christian ideas are expressed in the Declaration of Independence? Well, you can look up more than this, but what I put is that basically the Declaration of Independence recognized God as the supreme judge of men and nations. So if you look at it, it looked basically looking to God, that America was looking to God in the Declaration. So, and there's other Christian ideas. You can look them up in your book there. Give 3 reasons why the Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. Well, first of all, they wanted to tell their allies, they wanted to tell foreign allies, including France, including Russia, other allies at that time, and to tell them what was going on and what were their grievances so that they would know for sure why America was declaring a Declaration of Independence. So number 1 is to secure foreign allies or alliances. Number 2, to inform the colonists of the Crown's actions. So to tell the people, the colonists, the people of America, what the king was doing and how the king had ignored them and then declaring war on us. So basically to inform the colonists what the Crown's actions were so that they would know why they would have to go to war. So number 3, to preclude any colonial sentiment towards reconciliation with England. Basically to say, we tried as it may to reconcile with Great Britain, but the answer is now no. And now there's no way that we can reconcile with England, so we need to declare our country being independent from Great Britain. So, that's the end of this section in section 4. And you can do all your questions and such and your quizzes. And so then I'm going on to chapter 4. I was going to do it in this video, but the video is getting kind of long, so I think it's good that we focus now on, before we get into the Constitution, what actually is put together in 1789, when George Washington too is going to be unanimously elected as president. So what happened during that time, and then also to where we had from the Articles of the Confederation, that was our first constitution. From the Articles of the Confederation had to be revised into that point where we would have a president and an executive and judicial branch too, under the Constitution of the United States, which was ratified in 1789. So we're talking about a time from 1776 to 1789. You know, in 1789, George Washington would be made president of the United States. You forget that. You think, oh, right after 1776 and right after the 4th of July, George Washington would be president. Well, George Washington would be in charge of the armies, right? We know that. But we would not have a president, legally have a president, until 1789. So you can do the math from 1776 to 1789. So we have a number of years, you know, over a decade there.